you do not want Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia, as they become more prosperous, to be reliant on the OPECs or the Chinas or the, whoever may have you, the Russias of the world. You want them to have options. And so to give them some good, cost competitive Western democratic options is very important, very important.
Hi, and welcome to Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Inside Policy Talks. I'm Alex Dalziel. I'm the National Security Project Lead at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you back to talk about something that's not just fundamental to Canada, but is fundamental to understanding global politics and security in the world as it is today, and that is energy security. And I couldn't be joined by a better person to talk about this. One of Canada's foremost voices on the topic is Heather Exner-Pirot, who's also a senior fellow here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and she directs our energy mining and program. So Heather, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks, Alex.
So I think we can just dive right into this. And, you usefully talk about in some of your writings this kind of two-part definition of energy security. So I'll just ask you right up front, how do you define energy security?
Yeah, there would be a classic international relations definition, is that ability of a state to be able to acquire and to be able to have, the sufficient amounts of energy for their own purposes, not be susceptible, to adversaries or to supply chain disruptions, but have that security supply. So kind of a traditional security one. And there's the consumer side, is that you want to have reliable, affordable security. If it's not affordable, you're not energy secure. And then sustainability comes into the question too, that, there's a security aspect to having more sustainable energy production going forward, thinking of climate crisis. So there's a few different dimensions, and then we'll get into it. But, if from a Japanese or Korean perspective, where you are an energy importer, then those state security dimensions are much more at the forefront. For Canada, we are lucky enough that we can really be complacent about it, and then we can focus more on the cost and the reliability and even the sustainability issues.
Right. Well, it's certainly an asset that we have that can play. I mean, given the need of other people, or other countries to this, maybe that's something we can come back to here. Because I think in the popular conception, most people think of Canada as a bit of an energy power and as a mining power. Is this accurate? And I mean, if it is or if it isn't, how does that fit into what we're seeing internationally right now in terms of the of energy markets and dynamics?
Yeah. So, I mean, Canada is blessed. We're the second largest country, only 40 million people, so we have a lot to export. In a lot of cases, China, United States are about the same size. We're not much bigger than those countries, but their populations are so much bigger. They're such huge consumers that a lot of what they produce, they just have to consume for themselves. And so when it comes to geopolitics, having that ability to export, being able to choose your markets is a huge advantage as leverage. But so we are blessed in many resources, not everything. In energy, for sure, oil. We have the world's fourth largest oil reserves. I think we're the fourth largest producer, or the fourth largest exporter anyways. Natural gas, similarly, we're a very huge exporter. We have great reserves. And the important thing I want people to, this is a point I would like to raise every single day. Other than the United States, which maybe, 9th or 10th, Norway's, I think, maybe 12th or 13th largest reserves. Canada's the only democracy on that list of countries with large reserves. And if we think about, some countries' reserves maturing, going forward, thinking ahead 2-3 decades, where we'll certainly still be using hydrocarbons, it's critical that you still have a large democracy. In this case, it's got to be Canada that is providing some proportion of the world's oil and gas needs. Again, from a security perspective, we don't have to produce half of it or most of it, but having redundancy, having options, having an ability for democracy to increase production in the case of a conflict That's very important. So we need to maintain that market access. Now, what's interesting on the energy front is that until 2 months ago, Canada was mostly just a regional producer. That about 96, 97, 99% of our gas, 96% of our oil went to the United States. That really, when we were exporting, we were only exporting to the United States. Now TMX just started up in May. We've already been sending and have deliveries to India, to China, to South Korea, Japan. People weren't sure who would be buying this, but we're getting some good buyers in Asia. And then next year we'll have LNG Canada phase 1 up and running. So finally we're going to have some global exports of oil and gas, not just American exports. And again, from an energy security, geopolitical perspective, that's very different. Then I'm just going to move quickly to minerals, Alex. Minerals is a very different market from oil and gas, whereas just about every continent has oil and gas, just about every continent has refining capacity in oil and gas. Critical minerals, especially, are quite geographically concentrated. So that in the case of most of the things we depend on, if you think of copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese, rare earths, anything like that, usually you're talking about 2 or 3 countries that have the majority of, a plurality majority of production. And that's just how the deposits have been, where you have some world-class deposits.
Right.
And so Canada is, I think we're maybe 8th, we are a copper producer. We're not a huge copper producer. I think we're 6th for nickel. That's significant, but it's not geopolitically significant. The only 2 critical minerals in which Canada has an effect on global markets is uranium and potash. Both happen to be in Saskatchewan, where we're the world's number 1 or number 2 producer, and shutting in a mine or using it, you can really sway global markets. Everything else, we are an important contributor, but we're not dominant by any stretch.
Where would you focus on that issue if you wanted to, given that we have all this other wealth and possibility? Like if we were to develop some of these other critical minerals, et cetera, and then let's include LNG in this, like what markets, what resources could we develop and what markets should we be targeting?
Yeah. So for me, oil and gas, I'm sorry, we have to continue producing. We've never produced more and we've never exported more. So we are hitting records. So we are moving those things. But, we have the reserves that we could certainly have Russian levels of exports if we wanted to develop it. But we certainly can't turn back. Again, because, American shale at some point this decade is going to plateau, probably slowly decline. Norway production again, European production. You just don't want to be that dependent on OPEC and Russia. This is not a controversial thing to say. So making sure that between the United States and Canada, we have that good share of the proportion of the market. And as American production becomes a smaller share in the next coming years, a lot of people I expect, it's going to be important for Canada to maintain that market share for democracies for North America. On minerals, we should be everyone needs to develop more copper. Copper is the bottleneck. You need it for everything in electrification, and regardless of climate goals, regardless, you're still going to need copper. If you have no climate policy, you're still going to need that copper. If you have climate policy, you're going to need so much copper, and the market is starting to reward that. So BC has great copper deposits. Saskatchewan is moving forward on a project. Yukon has some copper. We do have options. Even if we're not going to be a world-leading producer, it's still important, again, that a democracy, that a North American producer is coming on stronger than we've been. And then rare earths, only because China dominates that market, and it's just essential. And it's not a big market at all. But it's just, these are things that China has a monopoly, real dominance on, and we just need some more redundancy. And so we do need, more rare earths and processing, and we're starting to figure that out, I think.
Well, a couple of times you've hit on it here about democracy, and I think there's an interesting issue there about how that's priced in, about how redundancy. That would kind of be a word that 10 years ago, supply chains, et cetera, were supposed to remove redundancy. Now it's seen as a virtue, and I think in that context, it's worth looking at these rare earth elements, which again, as you've alluded to, are crucial to any sort of sense of creating a bigger mix of renewable or low or zero emission fuels in our energy mix. I mean, China, I believe, mines about 60% of the rare earths and processes 90%. So it's a huge number. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that issue of, pricing democracy into this, and how our government is responding, and maybe what we're seeing elsewhere in terms of some of these things that would have been seen as externalities maybe even 5 years ago.
Yeah, and this is such an interesting conversation, Alex, because we went through a long period where the world was flat, where you were just going to the cheapest producer, and that happened to be, in a lot of cases, China. And China really, to their credit, I guess, you can't, a state's going to act in their best interest,
right,
really cornered a lot of those critical minerals. Doesn't have great oil and gas. And so really cornered that critical minerals and that supply chain. And then led to solar panels, lithium ion batteries, EVs, dominating those, those kind of green technologies in the manufacture of them and the supply chain for them. And I think until 2022, we were all kind of okay with that. That was still, you were getting cheaper solar panels. In a sense, many people argue you can go faster in the energy transition if you just use these cheaper Chinese products and if you had more expensive European or North American products. But now, I think, that security is coming back into the conversation. And I think the supply chain hiccups we had with COVID awoke us to the complexity of the system that we've created, the vulnerability of the system we've created. But then it gets to who's going to pay more, Alex. And that's why, from a state interest, from a Canadian or American interest, you would say we should have more Canadian and North American manufacturing, European manufacturing. But who is the customer that's going to pay more? Who is the middleman? Who is the manufacturer that's going to source from Canada if it's twice as much, if it's 3 times as much? And so there's an extent to which governments, democracies can subsidize that manufacture. But is it competitive? Even if you're subsidizing it, is it still competitive with China? And I guess if you were to put a price, what is the price on that democracy? It's the tariff that Europeans and Americans have recently put on Chinese products. That is the most concrete, objective, representative of what is the price that you're going to pay for a friendly produced product versus one from your adversary, and that's the tariff on the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you won't know the price of it, the value of it, at least until it's gone, right? I mean, that's the ever-going.
Yeah, and we felt some of that pain. I mean, certainly Germans and a lot of Europeans felt that pain, and the price of their energy skyrocketing. And that's just to say, yeah, Russian gas is still the cheapest gas for Europe to import. That is still a fact. But was it cheap for them in the end? No, it was extremely expensive. Their energy is extremely expensive now because they had to respond to it. So trying to have that redundancy, trying to plan for those eventualities in advance is, obviously it's in the interest of a state, and it's their responsibility.
So you have a couple of countries in the world that are, very clearly full authoritarian countries. Venezuela, Russia as major oil and gas producers. We have, in terms of energy transition to net zero, we have China as a major player. If we're looking at opportunities for Canada, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific as geostrategists call it, and the kind of much more, I think, controversial market, which is Europe, on for liquefied natural gas. Would you have some comments there?
Yeah, I mean, there is a business case for LNG to Europe, and I'll get to that. But it is undeniable that most of our natural gas in Canada is on the western side of the hemisphere, and that Asia is a far better and far faster growing market than Europe. People are making good money selling LNG to Europe. That's why I say there is a business case. Proponents wanted to sell LNG to Europe. Canada sells LNG to Europe, but we just go 6,000 kilometers south to the Gulf of Mexico, and it's American exporters that actually end up selling Canadian natural gas to Europe. So it's certainly possible. It's certainly a business case. They pay a good price for that LNG. But if you were thinking of, building new terminals 20, 30 years down the line, absolutely Asia is the market. We have tremendous, in that sense, we're lucky is that where our natural gas and oils on the west side of the hemisphere, is pretty good for that Asian market. And, there's 5 billion people there now for one. But one interesting statistic I've heard and have been sharing is that, we expect another 1.5 billion Asians to enter the middle class in the next decade. The entire population of Europe, North America, South Korea, Japan, Australia, combined is about 1 billion people. And here we're going to have 1.5 billion Asians move from a lower to a middle class. What happens when you reach the middle class? By definition, you are consuming more energy and more resources. That is what it means to be middle class. You have more material benefits. And so they will need, that's why, maybe emissions will go down in North America and Europe because populations are slowing. Certainly populations already peaked in Europe. But in Asia, there is nowhere for energy demand to go but up. And they will want that natural gas. They will want that oil. They will want that uranium. They will want that copper, all those things. And it's a pretty clear shot over the North Pacific to get to Asian allies and customers. You don't have to go through the Red Sea. You don't have to go through the Panama Canal. That's a huge advantage. You don't have to go through the Northern Sea route, and get a fleet of icebreakers. And there's just, you can't foresee in our lifetimes the end of growing energy demand in Asia. And how lucky we are. I'm actually right now at the Pacific Northwest Economic Region meeting of the northwestern states and provinces and territories. 26 million people we have in this region. I mean, if you're playing the game of Risk on a board game, you'd want to snap up this region so fast. And again, perfectly positioned to serve those 5 billion Asian customers.
So again, LNG is a crucial part of energy transition. We haven't talked much about Canada and renewables. You've done some recent research with MLI and the C.D. Howe Institute that talks about, basically Canadians are expecting their political leaders to look at, our energy resources through more than the climate change lens. We fully accept the challenge that climate change presents us, the wildfires, all the other things that are damaging the fabric of our communities and our economic competitiveness. But, again, think about China's dominant position. If we're talking about, zero emission and renewables, what role can Canada play there?
I mean, a huge role. I'm very bullish on Canada's prospects to contribute meaningfully to decarbonization. And this is where I want to distinguish between renewables and decarbonization. The goal is decarbonization. A lot of people, the way they talk, the way they act, it sounds like solar penetration is their goal. It's just to have more output from solar. Right. That would be a means, not an end. And it's not always a good means. Like I say, and like we all are aware, the Chinese dominate the solar photovoltaic, market and the supply chain, and the batteries too that you would need to back up solar, which makes solar not that affordable, not that cheap. In Canada, we are blessed with oil, gas, uranium, water. And so I do question any policy that not only subsidize, but mandates dependence on products that the Chinese have, on solar panels, on wind, on batteries. We can decarbonize with we have great options for decarbonization in Canada with carbon capture, with nuclear. I haven't said it, but I talk about it all the time. The Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan is the world's richest reserve of uranium. We're the second biggest producer. And hydroelectricity, obviously, which is why our grid is already very competitive on the decarbonizing, kind of aspect. Pump storage, instead of batteries, you could do pump storage. So what
is pump storage? I should pause you on that because that's a term we hear now more frequently. And what exactly is it?
I think it just uses, when you have excess energy, you can pump hydro, into a basin. And then when you don't have, it's like a battery, like if you could use excess wind or solar to pump hydro to higher gravity. And then when you need that energy, then you just release it. You're just using gravity of the hydro. But when you have excess energy, you can pump it up to a higher spot.
Great. Thanks for that.
So it's a natural, it's Mother Nature's battery. Also less materials intense. Nuclear is less materials intense, these things. So again, Canada, and this is where I think, what is the role you can play in global decarbonization? Again, appreciating that those 5 billion Asians, 1.5 billion going to be middle class. that they will consume more energy. There's nothing you can do to stop them from consuming more energy, and it's a human right, and it's important to development. And so coming up with solutions where you can have energy abundance rather than degrowth, have energy abundance with cleaner sources like nuclear, like carbon capture, rather than focusing on degrowth, which is, to me, a fundamentally anti-human policy tact.
Yeah, well, who's degrowth?
And never yours, right?
So this, I think we've touched on it here in a few points about, the importance of, when you look at some of the competitors here, Russia, China, countries that we have problematic, to say the least, and in some cases, particularly Russia, relations with. The other part, it's so much of the 2% debate around NATO and Canada, stepping up and spending. How do you look at this in relation to the United States? We're in an election years there. Every weekend brings some new development on the political front. How should we be thinking about our energy riches as part of our relationship with the United States in North America?
Yeah, and we should be. And I worry that Ottawa does not see it as an asset, does not see it as leverage, sees it as an embarrassment. And I had to, as our prime minister said at the World Economic Forum in 2015, we want you to know us for our resourcefulness, not for our resources. Well, DC knows us for our resources. Anyway, so I do think about this. We are laggards on defense spending. We saw very concrete pushback by many senators. We know you'll get pushback from a Trump president, from a Trump administration. And so how can we demonstrate our usefulness to our allies, especially the United States, especially coming into CUSMA renegotiations as early as 2026? And our best card, the ace that we have up our sleeve, is our oil exports. And you have to be so honest about that. We've never exported more to the United States, even as they've had the shale revolution, even as they've gone from the world's biggest importer to the world's biggest producer. A lot of their refineries, their refinery complex depends on a heavier oil than what they're producing for themselves. So they need that Canadian heavy, they're exporting about 4 million barrels a day, but they're exporting lighter stuff and they're importing our heavier stuff. So for them, it's just about a wash. And like I say, a lot of people expect in the next few years that it's a non-renewable resource, that their shale oil is getting lighter, is getting gassier, that oil production will start to slide. They've gone through their best shale reserves. They went through their best conventional, 2 or 3 decades ago. And so, 5 million barrels of oil a day is our ace up the sleeve. And this is the scenario. If you were going to put a 10% tariff on everything, are you going to put a 10% tariff on that oil? That would absolutely be pain at the pump for the American customer. You would just make energy 10%, more expensive. So that's not a good option for them. And so you say, well, what are we going to put tariffs on then? And wouldn't it be better if we just had free trade and you kept getting these just about 5 million barrels? There'll probably be 5 million barrels at the time. And then the last card is, we probably should have had a Keystone XL. Probably they would have liked a Keystone XL. Maybe they will need a Keystone XL again in 5 years. And with TMX, we can send those barrels elsewhere. With a Northern Gateway, you could send those barrels to Asia, who I just mentioned. They will take those barrels. They will need those barrels. And so to say, if we ramped up production by 1 million, do you want it to go to you? Or should we be looking at sending it somewhere else? And those are, and again, they're our best friend. And we've got a lot of places where we should be picking up the slack. But that for me is a place where we could say, we have some leverage here. If you're thinking about a blanket tariff, it will hurt you in many other ways.
Yeah. So it's a very tight relationship, but hardball economics does come in there. So we need to.
It will with the Trump administration. It will. So. It's just nice that we have a card that we could play if, but of course no one wants, we want to be on the same team. We don't want to be playing against each other.
So if you had to, maybe I'll just, we're getting towards the end here. So, Heather's wish list, if Canada could do 2 or 3 things that would, optimize our competitiveness and optimize our use of our energy resources as a security asset, to protect Canadians' safety in an increasingly unpredictable world, what would they be?
Yeah, Stephen Harper said, we can be an energy superpower. And that was right before the shale revolution really took off, and it didn't really happen. Energy prices went low. We've been in a commodities down cycle for a decade. But what goes up must go down, and what goes down must go up. And you start to see the signs of the commodity cycle turning, and of the geopolitical situation worsening, and of wanting, the world is not flat, friendshoring, onshoring, all becomes more important. So this is the time where Canada still has tremendous reserves. A lot of our deposits are still untapped, not maturing. A lot of people can't say that. And where we could flex our muscles and be that energy superpower, be that resource superpower, especially for a nuclear future, absolutely have a huge role to play in, again, where uranium is fairly concentrated, but luckily it's concentrated in Kazakhstan, Canada, and Australia. So to say, if you go the nuclear route, that won't be compromising your security. You will have options. You will have friendly options for that uranium supply for a long time, and encourage that. And the agriculture and forestry. I mean, again, the farmland, we have the ability to export most of it. The forests that we still have for building materials for, the extra billions of people entering the middle class. And so to finally, just to be strategic, this is my wish list for Canada, to be strategic with these resources, to look at what we have and to think about what could we do with resources? Where could we sell it? What could we produce that would advance our foreign interests and our foreign policy, and not just, let the market take it to the United States and kind of not think anything beyond that. And it's not that I think our exports to the United States should diminish. It's just, let's extend ourselves into other areas, and just, you do not want Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia, as they become more prosperous, to be reliant on the OPECs or the Chinas or the, whoever may have you, the Russias of the world. You want them to have options. You don't want them to fall under that sphere. And so to give them some good, cost competitive Western democratic options is very important, very important. And Canada, and Canada has the biggest role to play in this. Australia also has a very big role to play, and we should work with them on that too. But yeah, our allies, Europe, South Korea, Japan, are mostly energy and resource importers. And so allowing them to be able to acquire that, to be secure in their supply chains, to be strong, to have the liberal world order be strong. The highest and best purpose Canada can play is in exporting our energy and resources in a way that advances that.
I think that's a real insight into what keeps Canadians safe and prosperous there, and make sure we have hopefully a say to some extent in keeping a world that's more balanced and stable. And I think you've done a great job of portraying how energy, even mentioning food, protein, is something we can come back to in a future podcast, and food security, which is really, just another form of the energy security question. Thank you so much, Heather, for this. I think you've done a great job at explaining some of the basic fundamentals here and providing some real sharp insight into why this is specifically very important for Canada, in a country that's kind of accustomed to thinking, we don't stack up internationally. Here we have a real chance to, see some of the higher ground and play a role that advances our interests, our prosperity, and our core values as well. I hope we can get you back on here at some point to maybe pick up on some of the specific issues. So thank you very much. To our listeners, I'd like to thank you for tuning in to Inside Policy Talks. I continue to seek out more national security relevant topics. Please do check out our recent episodes on foreign interference and on financial crime. And we'll be looking a little bit more at the North American national security picture in the weeks to come. I'm Alex Dalziel for Inside Policy Talks. Have a great day.